What happened when your wealthy grandma cut you out of the will for dating the wrong type? My grandmother told me over tea and scones that I had exactly 6 months to end my relationship, or I'd lose my $8 million inheritance. She said it so casually, like she was commenting on the weather. Darling, you understand this is for your own good. The fine china didn't even rattle when she set down her cup. I'd been dating Marcus for 2 years. He was a high school teacher who drove a 10-year-old Honda and lived in a modest apartment across town. My grandmother, Catherine Ashford, had built a real estate empire worth over $40 million. She lived in a mansion with 7 bedrooms, employed a full staff, and expected her family to marry within certain circles. Marcus definitely wasn't in those circles. The funny thing is, I'd been her favorite grandchild my entire life. While my cousins got savings bonds for birthdays, I got trips to Europe. She paid for my private school education and my Ivy League degree. Every Sunday, I'd have dinner at her estate, and she'd tell me stories about building her company from nothing in the 1960s. I admired her strength and independence. I thought she'd understand when I fell in love with someone genuine instead of the trust fund boys she kept introducing me at charity galas. I was wrong. It started small. She'd make comments about Marcus's profession. A teacher? How noble. But surely not enough to maintain the lifestyle you're accustomed to. Then she'd casually mention eligible bachelors from prominent families. The Henderson boy just made partner at his father's firm. Wouldn't hurt to keep your options open. I ignored the hints. Marcus made me happy in ways money never could. He'd pack picnics for us in the park. He'd leave sweet notes in my apartment. He taught underprivileged kids and actually cared about making a difference. After a lifetime of watching wealthy people obsess over status and appearances, Marcus was refreshing and real. That's when grandmother escalated things. She hired a private investigator. I didn't know until Marcus called me, shaking, saying a man had approached his principal asking questions about his background, his family, his finances. The investigator went through Marcus's entire life. His credit score, his employment history, even interviewed his ex-girlfriend from college. Grandmother wanted ammunition to prove Marcus was unsuitable. When I confronted her, she didn't even deny it. I'm protecting you, Sophia. You don't understand how men like him operate. He's clearly after your future inheritance. She'd had her lawyers draw up a detailed report. Every piece of Marcus's financial history was analyzed to paint him as a gold digger. Never mind that Marcus didn't even know about my inheritance when we started dating. Never mind that he'd never asked me for a single dollar. The Sunday dinners became interrogations. She'd invite me alone, making it clear Marcus wasn't welcome. She'd spend hours trying to convince me I was making a mistake. You're 28 years old. You have your whole life ahead of you. Don't throw away your future for some momentary infatuation. Her tone made it sound like I was a foolish child who didn't understand the real world. Then came the ultimatum. 6 months to end it, or she'd remove me from the will entirely. She'd divide my portion between my cousins, James and Victoria, who'd both married appropriately wealthy spouses. She had the revised will right there on her desk, already drafted by her attorneys. All she needed to do was sign it. I looked at that document. $8 million. Enough to never worry about money again. Enough to start any business I wanted. Enough to travel the world. All I had to do was break Marcus's heart and pretend to be single for however many years grandmother had left. She was 83 and in perfect health, so that could be a long time. Marcus and I talked about it that night in his small apartment. He sat on his worn couch and told me he'd understand if I needed to do what was best for my future. He actually said he'd step aside if it meant I'd be financially secure. That's the moment I knew for certain I was making the right choice keeping him. I called grandmother the next morning and told her I wasn't ending my relationship. There was silence on the phone for a long moment. Then she said, I see. Well, don't say I didn't warn you. She hung up before I could respond. 2 weeks later, I received a formal letter from her attorneys. I'd been removed from the will. My cousins would split my share. The letter included a clause stating this decision was final and irrevocable unless I met certain conditions before her passing. Those conditions were simple: end my relationship with Marcus and marry someone from her approved list of families within 2 years. My parents were furious, but not at grandmother. They blamed me. My mother actually cried and asked why I was being so selfish. Do you know what you're throwing away? Your grandmother built that fortune for this family. For you. And you're choosing some random teacher over your own family legacy? My father just shook his head and said I'd regret this when I was older and struggling financially. Only my younger brother Daniel supported my decision. He'd always hated the family politics and the constant pressure to perform for grandmother's approval. He told me he was proud I'd chosen love over money. That meant more to me than any inheritance. The next few months were strange. I kept expecting grandmother to reach out, to soften her position. She didn't. I heard through family gossip that she'd completely redecorated the room in her mansion that used to be my room when I'd stay over. She'd removed all my photos from her walls. It was like I'd been erased from her life entirely. Marcus felt terrible about the whole situation. He offered multiple times to step back, to give me space to reconcile with my family. I refused. We'd chosen each other, and I wasn't going to let emotional manipulation change that. Then something unexpected happened. My cousin Victoria called me crying. She just had a massive fight with grandmother about her own life choices. Victoria wanted to go back to school and get her master's degree, but grandmother thought it was a waste of time since Victoria already had her inheritance secured through marriage. Grandmother had actually threatened to reduce Victoria's portion if she pursued unnecessary education instead of focusing on producing heirs. Victoria and I met for coffee, and she apologized for being part of the will change. She admitted she'd felt guilty taking my share but had been too intimidated by grandmother to say anything. We talked for hours about how grandmother controlled everyone in the family through money and fear. How James only stayed at his father-in-law's company because grandmother approved. How Victoria's marriage was miserable, but she stayed for financial security. After that conversation, Victoria did something brave. She enrolled in her master's program anyway. Grandmother immediately cut her stipend and threatened to reduce her inheritance. Victoria didn't care. She'd realized what I'd already figured out. Grandmother's money came with invisible chains. 6 months after being disinherited, I got a call from an attorney I'd never heard of. His name was Richard Walsh, and he said he needed to meet with me regarding Catherine Ashford's estate. I assumed grandmother had died, and my heart sank despite everything. She was still my grandmother, and I'd loved her despite her controlling behavior. But Richard explained grandmother was alive and well. He represented her, but he had concerns about her recent decisions. He couldn't share specific details over the phone, but he needed to meet in person immediately. His tone was urgent. We met at his office downtown. Richard had been grandmother's attorney for over 30 years. He'd helped her build and protect her empire. What he told me changed everything. Grandmother hadn't just hired a private investigator to check Marcus's background. She'd also investigated several other family members, including James and Victoria. Richard had copies of reports I wasn't supposed to see. The investigation into James revealed his company was failing, and he'd been hiding significant debts from everyone, including grandmother. He'd been slowly borrowing against his expected inheritance through private loans, assuming the money would eventually cover everything. Victoria's husband had been having an affair for years. The investigator had photos, hotel receipts, everything. Grandmother knew about it, but had told Victoria's husband she'd keep it quiet as long as he stayed married to Victoria and maintained appearances. But the biggest shock was about my Uncle Thomas, grandmother's only son, and my father. The investigator had discovered Thomas had been embezzling from grandmother's company for years. Small amounts at first, then larger sums. He'd hidden it by manipulating accounting records and creating fake expenses. Richard estimated my father had stolen over $2 million. Richard showed me everything. Bank statements, forged signatures, fake invoices. My father had been stealing from his own mother while lecturing me about family loyalty and respecting grandmother's wishes. I felt sick. My father had called me selfish for choosing love over money, when he'd been literally stealing from the family fortune. Richard explained why he'd reached out. He was ethically conflicted because grandmother knew about the theft but refused to prosecute. She wanted to keep everything quiet to avoid scandal. She'd rather disinherit me for dating someone she didn't approve of than hold her own son accountable for actual crimes. Richard believed this was wrong. He'd advised grandmother to report the theft and restructure her estate fairly, but she'd refused. She'd told him to handle the revised will removing me, and he'd realized he couldn't keep enabling her control and manipulation anymore. He'd come to me because he thought I deserved to know the truth about why I was really being disinherited. It wasn't about Marcus at all. It was about grandmother maintaining total control over her family through financial manipulation. I was being punished for being the only one brave enough to make choices she didn't approve of. The documents Richard showed me were copies he'd made before grandmother could have them destroyed. He'd kept them as insurance, knowing something wasn't right. He told me he was resigning as her attorney and wanted to help me if I decided to take legal action. I sat in his office for over an hour trying to process everything. My father was a thief. My cousins were trapped in miserable situations for money. Grandmother knew everything and used it to control everyone. The whole family was built on secrets and lies. Marcus met me after the meeting, and I told him everything. He held me while I cried angry tears about my family's dysfunction. Then he said something that stuck with me. Money reveals who people really are. It doesn't change them, it just amplifies what was always there. I spent the next week deciding what to do. Part of me wanted to expose everything, to let the whole family know what grandmother had been doing. Another part wanted to just walk away completely and never look back. Then Victoria called again. She'd been cut off entirely for enrolling in school. Her husband had frozen their joint accounts. She had nowhere to go and was staying with a friend. She was finally leaving her marriage, but she was terrified and broke. That's when I made my decision. I hired Richard Walsh as my attorney. We were going to challenge grandmother's will and expose the truth about my father's theft. Not for revenge, but because Victoria deserved support and my grandmother's control needed to end. Richard filed a petition with the probate court, requesting an investigation into Catherine Ashford's estate management. The petition included evidence of my father's embezzlement and raised questions about whether grandmother was making sound decisions about her will changes while aware of family members' criminal activity. The legal filing became public record. Within hours, my phone exploded with calls from family members. My mother screamed at me for betraying the family. James left angry voicemails saying I was destroying everything out of spite. My father didn't call at all. Grandmother finally reached out 3 days later. Her assistant scheduled a meeting at her mansion. Just the two of us. I drove to the estate I'd visited hundreds of times growing up. The gates looked the same. The gardens were perfectly maintained. But everything felt different now. Grandmother sat in her usual chair in the library. She looked older than I remembered, smaller somehow. She gestured to the seat across from her, and I sat down. "You've made quite a mess," she said quietly. "I learned from the best," I replied. She actually smiled at that. Then her expression turned serious. "Your father's situation will be handled privately. The investigation will show the money was repaid. He stole from you for years. He's my son. That's different than you choosing some unsuitable man over your family. Marcus never stole from anyone. Dad is an actual criminal, but you protect him. That's the difference you don't see." We sat in silence for a moment. Then grandmother said something I never expected. "Do you know why I worked so hard to build this company? Why I fought and sacrificed and made difficult choices?" I shook my head. "Because I married for love. Your grandfather was a kind man with no ambition and no money. My parents disowned me. I built everything from nothing because I had to. And it was hard, Sophia. Harder than you can imagine. I wanted to give my children and grandchildren the security I never had. I wanted them to make smart choices that would protect them. You wanted to control them. I wanted to save them from my mistakes. But grandmother, you chose love. And you built an empire anyway. Why can't I do both?" She looked at me for a long time. Then she stood up and walked to her desk. She pulled out a document and handed it to me. It was her original will. The one from before she'd made any changes. My name was still there, with my full inheritance intact. "I never signed the new will," she said quietly. "I wanted to see what you'd do. If you'd come crawling back, if you'd break under pressure. If Marcus would leave you when the money disappeared." I stared at her, not believing what I was hearing. "You passed the test." "A test? You put me through hell as a test?" "I put you through a fraction of what I endured when I chose your grandfather. And you didn't break. Neither did your young man. That's when I knew he might actually be worth keeping." I wanted to scream at her, to tell her how manipulative and cruel she'd been. But I was too exhausted from months of stress. "The revised will was real," she continued. "I could have signed it any time. But I wanted to see if you'd choose love over money. If you'd be strong enough to build your own life. Your cousins failed that test years ago. Your father certainly failed it. But you didn't." "What about the investigation?" I asked. "The court filing? Richard is a good attorney. He'll withdraw the petition. Your father will quietly repay what he took with interest. And I'll make some changes to my estate structure that should have been made years ago." She walked to the window overlooking her gardens. "I'm 83 years old, Sophia. I won't live forever. I needed to know my fortune would go to someone strong enough to handle it. Someone who couldn't be bought or controlled. Someone like me. I don't want your money if it comes with conditions. There are no conditions now. You've already proven yourself. The money is yours when I pass, regardless of who you marry or what choices you make. I'm also setting up a trust for Victoria to help her leave her marriage." She finally showed some spine. I should have felt relieved. Instead, I just felt angry. You could have just talked to me. Instead of games and manipulation. Would you have understood without living through it? Would you have known what you were capable of? She had a point, but I wasn't ready to admit it. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," grandmother continued. "I'm difficult and controlling, I know that. But I'm also trying to protect what I built and ensure it goes to the right people. Sometimes that requires testing them." Over the next few months, things slowly changed. Grandmother insisted on meeting Marcus properly, and they had dinner together. She grilled him about his teaching philosophy, his career goals, his family background. Marcus handled it all with patience and honesty. By the end of dinner, grandmother actually smiled and said, "He'll do." My father quietly repaid the money he'd stolen, though he never apologized to anyone. Grandmother restructured the company to remove him from any financial oversight. He accepted it without protest, probably relieved not to face criminal charges. Victoria moved into a small apartment and started her master's program. Grandmother funded it completely and set up a trust that gave Victoria independence for the first time in her life. Victoria and I became close again, bonding over family therapy sessions we both desperately needed. James remained trapped in his financial mess, but that was his own choice. He dug himself into debt trying to maintain a lifestyle he couldn't afford, and grandmother made it clear she wouldn't bail him out again. Sunday dinners resumed, but on different terms. Marcus came with me. Victoria came when she wasn't studying. We talked about real things instead of maintaining polite facades. Grandmother was still grandmother, controlling and opinionated, but she'd softened slightly. She pulled me aside after one dinner and said something I'll never forget. "I spent my whole life building security because I was scared of being poor again. But you're not scared. That's the difference between us. You chose love without fear, and that's stronger than any amount of money I could leave you." A year later, Marcus proposed during a sunset picnic in the same park where we'd had our first date. The ring was modest but perfect. I said yes before he even finished asking. Grandmother threw us an engagement party at her mansion. She invited everyone from her social circles, making it clear that Marcus was family now. She pulled me aside during the party and handed me an envelope. Inside was a check for the down payment on a house. "Every couple should start their marriage in their own home," she said. "Not a mansion, not an apartment. Something you choose together." Marcus and I found a modest house in a good neighborhood near his school. It needed work, but it was ours. We spent weekends painting walls and planting a garden. Grandmother visited once, walked through every room and simply said, "This suits you." She passed away 2 years after Marcus and I married. Peacefully in her sleep at 85 years old. The funeral was massive, filled with business associates and society people paying respects to the empire she'd built. The will reading was surprisingly drama-free. Grandmother had restructured everything clearly. I received my full inheritance as promised. Victoria got her trust plus an equal share. James got less than expected, with a note from grandmother explaining he needed to learn to live within his means. My father received his portion with restrictions preventing him from accessing the principal, only the income. But the biggest surprise was a letter grandmother had written for me, to be opened after her death. In it, she explained everything. How she'd watched me my whole life, seeing parts of herself in me. How she'd tested me not to be cruel, but because she knew I was strong enough to pass. How she'd needed to know her legacy would go to someone who couldn't be bought or broken. She apologized for the pain she'd caused, but didn't regret her methods. She said real strength comes from choosing what matters over what's easy, and I'd proven I had that strength. The letter ended with one line. "Don't just spend the money, Sophia. Build something with it. Leave your own legacy." Marcus and I used part of the inheritance to start a foundation supporting teachers and education initiatives. We still live in our modest house, though we could afford much larger. I volunteer with Victoria's program for women leaving difficult marriages. We take trips but drive sensible cars. We live comfortably but not ostentatiously. People sometimes ask if I regret the choice I made, if I wish I'd handled things differently with my grandmother. The truth is, I don't. Those months of being disinherited taught me what actually mattered. They showed me who my real family was, not the people bound by blood and money, but the people who stayed when things got hard. Marcus still teaches. He still drives an old car. He still packs picnics for us in the park. And I love him more now than I did when grandmother first told me to choose between him and $8 million. The money sits in investments and trusts, generating income for our foundation and our future. But the real inheritance wasn't the money. It was learning that I could stand on my own, that I could choose love over security, and that sometimes the people who test us the hardest are the ones who believe in us the most. Grandmother was difficult, manipulative, and controlling until the very end. But she was also strong, independent, and uncompromising in her values. She built an empire from nothing and protected it fiercely. She demanded the same strength from her heirs that she demanded from herself. I passed her test, but more importantly, I learned I didn't need her money to be happy. Having it now is nice, but I would have been fine without it. That's the real gift she gave me. Not the inheritance, but the confidence to know I could build my own life on my own terms. Every Sunday, Marcus and I have dinner together. Sometimes it's just us, sometimes Victoria joins. We tell stories and laugh and make plans for the future. The dining room table is modest compared to grandmother's formal table, but it's ours. And that's worth more than any inheritance could ever be. Thanks for sticking with me through all this. It's definitely been a journey worth sharing. Until we meet again, folks. If you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.